Last time we spoke about the Nanjing Massacre. Japanese forces breached Nanjing as Chinese defenders retreated under heavy bombardment. The city fell on December the 13th. In the following weeks, civilians and disarmed soldiers endured systematic slaughter, mass executions, rapes, looting, and arson, with casualties mounting rapidly. Amongst the most brutal episodes were the hundreds of executions near the safety zone, mass shootings along the Yangtze River, and killings at improvised sites and killing fields. The massacre involved tens of thousands of prisoners, with estimates up to 300,000 victims. Women and children were subjected to widespread rape, mutilation, and terror intended to crush morale and resistance. Although the safety zone saved many lives, it cannot shield all refugees from harm, and looting and arson devastated large parts of the city. Foreign witnesses, missionaries, and diary entries documented the extensive brutality and the apparent premeditated nature of many acts, noting the collapse of discipline amongst the troops and order that shaped the violence. This episode is Nanjing Has Fallen. The war is not over. Hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia. Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over in Echoes of War, we just began a mini-series covering the Greco-Persian Wars. If you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights to the subjects I will tackle next. The most recent exclusive podcast over there is not history related. It's actually about what was Sauron's plan to win the War of the Ring. So if you're a Tolkien fan, please go check it out. Directly after the fall of Nanjing, rumors circulated amongst the city's foreigners that Tang Xiongzhi had been executed for his inability to hold the city against the Japanese onslaught. In fact, unlike many of his subordinates who fought in its defense, he survived. On December the 12th, he slipped through the Yujiang Gate, where bullets from the 36th Division had claimed numerous victims, and he sailed across the Yangtze to safety. Chiang Kai-shek protected him from bearing the direct consequences for Nanjing's collapse. Tang Xiongzhi was not unscathed, however. After the conquest of Nanjing, a dejected Tang Xiongzhi met with General Li Zhongren at the Shuizhou railway station. In a brief 20-minute conversation, Tang lamented, "Sir, Nanjing's fall had been unexpectedly rapid. How can I face the world?" Li, who had previously taunted Tang Xiongzhi for his overeagerness, offered some sympathy. "Don't be discouraged. Victory or defeat comes every day for the soldier. Our war of resistance is a long-term proposition. The loss of one city is not so decisive." By December of 1937, the outlook for Chiang Kai-shek's regime remained quite bleak. Despite his public pledges, he had failed to defend the capital. Its sturdy walls that had withstood earlier sieges were breached in less than 100 hours. Foreign observers remained pessimistic about the prospects of continuing the fight against Japan. The New York Times had this to say: "The capture of Nanjing was the most overwhelming defeat suffered by the Chinese, and one of the most tragic military debacles in modern warfare. In defending Nanjing, the Chinese allowed themselves to be surrounded and then slaughtered. The graveyard of tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers may also be the graveyard of all Chinese hope of resisting conquest by Japan." Foreign diplomats also doubted Chiang Kai-shek's ability to sustain the war, giving the question to whether he would stubbornly continue a losing fight or seek peace. American Ambassador Nelson Johnson wrote in a letter to Admiral Yarnell, then commander of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet, "There is little left now for the Chinese to do except to carry on a desultory warfare in the country, or to negotiate for the best terms they can possibly get." Likewise, the Japanese, too, acted as if Chiang Kai-shek had already lost the war. They assumed the generalissimo was spent, in terms of Chinese politics as well, and a gentle push would suffice to topple his regime like a house of cards. On December the 14th, Prime Minister Hanoi announced that Chiang Kai-shek's losses of Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, and now Nanjing had created a brand new situation. The national government has become but a shadow of its former self. If a new Chinese regime emerged to replace Chiang Kai-shek's government, Japan would deal with it, provided it is a regime headed in the right direction. Hanoi spoke at a liaison conference in Tokyo that same day, where civilian and military leaders debated how to treat China now that it had been so thoroughly beaten on the battlefield. Japanese demands had grown significantly. Beyond recognizing Manchu Kuo, Japan pressed for the creation of a pro-Japanese regime in Inner Mongolia and North China. That same day, a puppet government was established in Japanese-occupied Beijing. While these demands aimed to end China as a unitary state, Japanese policy was moving towards the same goal. The transmissions of these demands via a German diplomatic channel caused shock and consternation in Chinese government circles, and the Chinese engaged in what many regarded as stalling tactics. Even at this late stage, there was division amongst Japan's top decision-makers. Tada, deputy chief of the Army General Staff, feared a protracted war in China and urged keeping negotiations alive. He faced strong opposition from the cabinet, including the foreign minister and the ministers of the Army and Navy, and ultimately he relented. Tada stated, "In this state of emergency, it is necessary to avoid any political upheaval that might arise from a struggle between the cabinet and the Army General Staff." Although he disagreed, he no longer challenged the uncompromising stance towards China. On January the 16th of 1938, Japan publicly stated that it would, quote, "cease henceforth to deal with Chiang Kai-shek." This was a line that could not be uncrossed. War was the only option, it seemed. Now, looking into the specifics of all of this, Germany, the mediator between China and Japan, also considered Chiang Kai-shek a losing bet. In late January of 1938, von Dirksen, the German ambassador to Tokyo, urged a fundamental shift in German diplomacy and advocated for abandoning China in favor of Japan. He warned that this was a matter of urgency, since Japan harbored grudges against Germany for its half-hearted peace efforts. In a report, von Dirksen wrote that Japan, quote, "Japan in her deep ill humor will confront us with unpleasant decisions at an inappropriate moment." Von Dirksen's view carried the day in Berlin. Nazi Germany and Hirohito's Japan were on a trajectory that within 3 years would forge the Axis and place Berlin and Tokyo in the same camp in a conflict that would eventually span the globe. Our old friend Rabe, who returned to Germany in 1938, found that his account of Japanese atrocities in Nanjing largely fell on deaf ears. He was even visited by the Gestapo, which apparently pressed him to keep quiet about what he had seen. Ambassador von Dirksen also argued in his January 1938 report that China should be abandoned because of its increasingly friendly ties with the Soviet Union. There was some merit to this claim. Soviet aid to China was pretty substantial. By the end of 1937, 450 Soviet aviators were serving in China. Without them, Japan would have likely enjoyed complete air supremacy. Chiang Kai-shek, it seemed, did not fully understand the Russians' motives. They were supplying aircraft and pilots to keep China in the war, while keeping themselves out of said war. After Nanjing's fall, Chiang Kai-shek nevertheless reached out to Joseph Stalin, inviting direct Soviet participation in the war. Stalin politely declined, noting that if the Soviet Union joined the conflict, the world would say the Soviet Union was an aggressor, and sympathy for Japan around the world would immediately increase. And in a rare moment of candor, a few months later, the Soviet Deputy Commissar for Foreign Affairs spoke with the French ambassador, describing the situation in China as splendid. He expected China to continue fighting for several more years, after which Japan would be too weakened to undertake any major operations against the Soviet Union in the Far East. It was clear that China was being used. Whatever the motive, China was receiving vital help from Stalin's Russia, while the rest of the world stood on the sidelines, reluctant to upset Japan. Until Operation Barbarossa, when the Soviet Union was forced to the brink by the German army and could no longer sustain extensive overseas aid, it supplied China with 904 planes, 1,516 trucks, 1,140 artillery pieces, 9,720 machine guns, over 50,000 rifles, and 31,000 bombs of various orders. Despite all of this, all in all, China's position proved less disastrous than many observers had feared. Chinese officials later argued that the Battle of Nanjing was not the unmitigated fiasco it appeared to be at the time. Tong Shengzhi had this to say in his later memoirs. "I think the main purpose of defending Nanjing was to buy time, to allow troops that had just been pulled out of battle to rest and regroup. It wasn't simply because it was the capital or the site of Sun Yat-sen's mausoleum." Tan Daoping, an officer in Nanjing, described the battle as a moderate success because it drew the Japanese further inland. This, of course, was a strategy anticipated by the interwar military thinker Zhang Bailu. It also allowed dozens of Chinese divisions to escape Shanghai, since the Japanese forces that could have pursued them were tied down with the task of taking Nanjing. Tan Daoping wrote after the war, "They erred in believing that they could wage a quick war and decide victory immediately. Instead, their dream was shattered. Parts of their forces were worn out, and they were hindered from achieving a swift end." Even so, it was a steep price that was paid in Chinese blood. As in Shanghai, the commanders in Nanjing thought that they could fight on the basis of sheer willpower. Chinese officer Qin Guoqi wrote in his memoirs, "In modern war, you can't rely on the spirit of the troops. You can't merely rely on physical courage and stamina. The Battle of Nanjing explains that better than anything." As for the brigade commander of the 87th Division, Chen Yuding, who emerged from Nanjing with only a few hundred survivors, well, he was rather pissed off. "During the 5 days of battle for Nanjing, my superiors didn't see me even once. They didn't do their duty. They also did not explain the overall deployment in the Nanjing area. What's even worse, they didn't give us an order to retreat. And afterwards, I didn't hear of any commander being disciplined for failing to do his job." Now, turning back to November of 1937, Chiang Kai-shek had moved his command to the Great Trinity that is known as Wuhan. For the nationalists, Wuhan was symbolically a potent stronghold. 3 municipalities in one: Hankou, Wuchang, and Hanyang. They had all grown prosperous as gateways between coastal China and the interior. However, the autumn disasters of 1937 thrust Wuhan into a new prominence, and a decade after it had ceased to be a temporary capital, it again became the seat of military command and resistance. Leading nationalist politicians had been seen in the city months before the war, fueling suspicion that Wuhan would play a major role in an imminent conflict. By the end of the year, the generals and their staffs, along with most of the foreign embassies, had moved upriver. Yet as 1937 slipped into 1938, the Japanese advance seemed practically unstoppable. From the destruction of Shanghai to the massacre in Nanjing, to the growing vulnerability of Wuhan, the NRA government appeared powerless against this onslaught. Now the Japanese government faced several options: expanding the scope of the war to force China into submission, which would risk further depletion of Japan's military and economic resources; establish an alternate regime in China as a bridge for reconciliation, thereby bypassing the nationalist government for negotiation; or engaging in indirect or direct peace negotiations with the nationalist government, despite the failure of previous attempts, while still seeking new opportunities for negotiation. However, the Nanjing Massacre did not compel the Chinese government nor its people to submit. On January the 2nd, Chiang Kai-shek wrote this in his diary: "The conditions proposed by Japan are equivalent to the conquest and extinction of our country. Rather than submitting and perishing, it is better to perish in defeat." Choosing to refuse negotiations and continue to resist. In January of 1938, there was a new escalation of hostilities. Up to that point, Japan had not officially declared war, even during the Shanghai campaign and the Nanjing Massacre. However, on January the 11th, an imperial conference was held in Tokyo in the presence of Emperor Hirohito. Prime Minister Kanoi outlined a fundamental policy to deal with the China incident. The imperial conference was attended by Prime Minister Fumimaro Kanoi, Army Chief of Staff Prince Kan'in, Naval Minister Admiral Fushimi, and others to reassess its policy towards China. Citing the nationalist government's delay and lack of sincerity, the Japanese leadership decided to terminate Chaltman's mediation. At the conference, Japan articulated a dual strategy. If the nationalist government did not seek peace, Japan would no longer regard it as a viable negotiating partner, instead supporting emerging regimes, seeking to resolve issues through incidents and aiming either to eliminate or incorporate the existing central government. If the nationalist government sought reconciliation, it would be required to cease resistance, cooperate with Japan against communism, and pursue economic cooperation, including officially recognizing Manchukuo and allowing Japanese troops in Inner Mongolia, North China, Central China, and co-governance over Shanghai. The Konoye cabinet relayed this proposal to the German ambassador in Japan on December the 22nd of 1937. It called for diplomatic recognition of Manchukuo, autonomy for Inner Mongolia, secession of all anti-Japanese and all anti-Manchukuo policies, cooperation between Japan, Manchukuo, and China against communism, war reparations, demilitarized zones in North China and Inner Mongolia, and a trade agreement between Japan, Manchukuo, and China. Its terms were far too severe, including reparations payable to Japan and new political arrangements that would formalize the separation of North China under Japanese control. Chiang Kai-shek's government would have 72 hours to accept. If they refused, Tokyo would no longer recognize the nationalist government and would seek to destroy it. On January the 13th, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Chonghui informed Germany that China needed a fuller understanding of the additional conditions for peace talks to make a decision. That wasn't going to happen. The January 15th deadline for accepting Japan's terms elapsed without any Chinese acceptance. On January the 11th, 6 days after the deadline for a Chinese government reply, an imperial conference, known as a Gozen Kaigi, was convened in Tokyo to consider how to handle Trotman's mediation. The Navy, seeing the war as essentially an army matter, offered no strong position. The army pressed for ending the war through diplomatic means, arguing that they faced a far more formidable Far Eastern Soviet threat at the northern part of Manchukuo's borders, and they wished to avoid a protracted attritional warfare. Foreign Minister Koki Hirota, however, strongly disagreed with the army, insisting there was no viable path to Trotman's mediation, given the vast gap between Chinese and Japanese positions. A second conference followed on January the 15th, attended by the empire's principal cabinet members and military leaders, but without the emperor's presence. The debate grew heated over whether to continue Trotman's mediation. Hayotada, deputy chief of the Army General Staff, argued for continuation, while Konoye, Hirota, Naval Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, and the War Minister, Hajime Sugiyama, opposed it. Ultimately, Tada acceded to the position of Konoye and Hirota. On that same day, Konoye convened the cabinet's conclusion and the termination of Trotman's mediation to the emperor. The Japanese government then issued a statement on January the 16th declaring that it would no longer treat the nationalist government as a bargaining partner, signaling the establishment of a new Chinese regime that would cooperate with Japan and realign bilateral relations. All of this became known as the First Konoye Statement, through which Tokyo formally ended Trotman's mediation attempts. The Chinese government was still weighing its response when, at noon on January the 16th, Konoye publicly declared, "Hereafter the imperial government will not deal with the national government." In Japanese, this became the infamous Aiti ni sezu, or absolutely no dealing. Over the following days, the Japanese government made it clear that this was a formal breach of relations. In the words of Foreign Minister Hirota Koki, it was stronger even than a declaration of war. The Chinese ambassador to Japan, who had been in Tokyo for 6 months since the hostilities began, was finally recalled. At the end of January, Chiang summoned a military conference and declared that the top strategic priority would be to defend the east-central Chinese city of Suzhou, about 500 kilometers north of Wuhan. This decision, like the mobilization near Lugoqiao, was heavily influenced by the railway. Suzhou sat on the midpoint of the Tianjin-Pukou-Jimpu line, and its seizure would grant the Japanese mastery over the north-south travel within central China. The Jimpu line also crossed the Langhai line, China's main cross-country artery from Lanzhou to the port of Lanyonggang, north of Shanghai. The Japanese military command marked the Jimpu line as a target in spring of 1938. Control over Suzhou and the railway lines threading through it were seen as a vital part of the defense of Wuhan, which lay to the city's south. Chiang's defense strategy fit a larger plan evolved since the 1920s, when the military thinker, Zhang Bailu, had first proposed a long war against Japan. Zhang's foresight earned him a position as an advisor to Chiang in 1938. Chiang had previously run the Baoding Military Academy, a predecessor to the Whampoa Academy, which had trained many of China's first young officers in the early Republic period of 1912 to 1922. Now many of the generals who had trained under Zhang gathered in Wuhan, and they would play a crucial role in defending the city, these being Chen Cheng, Bei Chongqi, Thong Shongju, and Shi Yue. They remained loyal to Chiang Kai-shek, but sought to avoid his tendency to micromanage every aspect of the strategy. Nobody could say with certainty whether Wuhan would endure the Japanese onslaught, and outsiders' predictions were quite gloomy. As Wuhan's inhabitants tasted their unexpected new freedoms, the Japanese pressed on with their conquest of central China. After taking Nanjing, the Imperial Japanese 13th Division crossed the Yangtze River to the north and advanced to Otang and Mingguang lines on the eastern bank of the Zhehe River in Anhui Province, while the Second Army of the North China Front crossed the Yellow River to the south between Qingcheng and Zhuyang in Shandong Province, where they occupied Jinan. Then they pressed towards Jining, Mengying, and Qingdao. To open the Jinpu Railway and connect the northern and southern battlefields, the Japanese headquarters mobilized 8 divisions, 3 brigades, and 2 detachments, a total of about 240,000 men. They were commanded by General Hata Shinoku, commander of the Central China Expeditionary Army, and Tarachi Hisayachi, the commander of the North China Front Army. Their plan was a north-south advance. First seize Suzhou, a strategic city in eastern China, then take Zhengzhou in the west along the Longhai Railway, connecting Lanzhou and Lianyanggang, and then finally push towards Wuhan in the south along the Ping'an Railway, connecting Beijing and Hankow. At the beginning of 1938, Japan's domestic mobilization and military reorganization had not yet been completed, and there was a shortage of troops to expand the front. At the Emperor's Imperial Conference on February the 16th, the General Staff Headquarters argued against launching operations before the summer of 1938, preferring to consolidate the front that year and undertake a large-scale battle in 1939. Although the Northern China Expeditionary Force and the Central China Expeditionary Force proposed a plan to open up the Jinpu Line to connect the northern and southern battlefields, the proposal was not approved by the domestic General Staff Headquarters. The Chinese Army, commanded by Li Xiongren, commander-in-chief of the 5th War Zone, mobilized about 64 divisions and 3 brigades, totaling roughly 600,000 men. The main force was positioned north of Suzhou to resist the southern Japanese advance, with a portion deployed along the southern Jinpu Railway to block the southern push and secure Suzhou. Early on in the campaign, Chiang Kai-shek redeployed the Heavy Artillery Brigade originally promised to Han Fuju to Tang Yinbo's forces. To preserve his strength, the Shandong provincial governor, Han Fuju, abandoned the long-standing Yellow River defenses in Shandong, allowing the Japanese to capture Shandong's capital of Jinan in early March of 1938. This defection opened the Jinpu Railway to attack. The Japanese 10th Division under Rensuke Isogai seized Tai'an, Jining, and Daewonko, ultimately placing northern Shandong under Japanese control. The aim now was to crush the Chinese between the two halves of a pincer movement. At Yishang and at Huaiyuan, north of Suzhou, both sides fought to the death. The Chinese could not drive back the Japanese, but the Japanese could not scatter the defenders either. At Linyi, about 50 kilometers northeast of Suzhou, Jiang Chuzhong, who had previously disgraced himself by abandoning the earlier battlefield, became a national hero for his determined efforts to stop the Japanese troops led by Hidegaki Seishiro, the conqueror of Manchuria. The Japanese hoped that they could pour in as many as 400,000 troops to destroy the Chinese forces holding the eastern and central parts of China. Chiang Kai-shek was determined that this should not happen, recognizing that the fall of Suzhou would place Wuhan in extreme danger. On April 1st, he addressed the Nationalist Party delegates, linking the defense of Wuhan to the fate of the party itself. He noted that although the Japanese had invaded 7 provinces, they had only actually captured provincial capitals and main transport routes, while villages and towns off of those routes remained unconquered. The Japanese, he argued, might muster more than 500,000 soldiers, but after about 8 or 9 months, they would become bogged down. Chiang asserted that as long as Guangzhou remained in Chinese hands, it would be of little significance if the Japanese invaded Wuhan, since Guangzhou would keep China's sea links open, and, of course, there was the rest of Guangdong. Sun Yat-sen's homeland would serve as a revolutionary base area. If the Walren, which is a racist term for Japanese meaning dwarfs, attacked Wuhan and Guangzhou, it would cost them dearly and threaten their control over the occupied zones. He reiterated his plan. The base area for our war will not be in the zones east of Beiping, Wuhan, or Wuhan-Guangdong's railway lines, but to the west. And for this reason, he authorized withdrawing Chinese troops behind the railway lines. Chiang's speech mixed defiance with an explanation of why regrouping was necessary. It was a bold public posture in the face of developing military disasters, yet it reflected the impossible balance he faced between signaling resolve and avoiding overcommitment of a city that might still fall. Holding Suzhou as the first priority required Chiang Kai-shek to place a great deal of trust in one of his old rivals, the southwestern general Li Zongren. The relationship between Chiang Kai-shek and Li Zongren had become one of the most ambivalent in wartime China. Li hailed from Guangxi, a province in the southwestern part of China long regarded by the eastern heartland as half-civilized. Its people had rarely felt fully part of the empire ruled from Beijing or even Nanjing, and in the early Republic period there was a strong push for regional autonomy. Li was part of a cohort of young officers trained in regional academies who sought to bring Guangxi under national control. He joined the Nationalist Party in 1923, the year Dr. Sun Yat-sen announced his alliance with the Soviets. Li was not a Baoding Academy graduate, but he had trained at Yunnan's equivalent institution, which shared similar views on military professionalism. He enthusiastically took part in the Northern Expedition and played a crucial role in the National Revolutionary Army's ascent to control over much of North China. Yet after the Nanjing government took power, Li grew wary of Chiang's bid to centralize authority in his own person. In the 1930s, Li's so-called Guangxi clique participated in the Central Plains War, the failed effort by militarist leaders to topple Chiang Kai-shek. Although the plot failed, Li retreated to his southwest base, ready to challenge Chiang Kai-shek again. The occupation of Manchuria in 1931 reinforced Li's beliefs that a Japanese threat posed a greater danger than Chiang's centralization. The tension between the two men was evident from the outset of the war. On October the 10th of 1937, Chiang appointed Li commander of the Fifth War Zone. Li agreed on the condition that Chiang refrain from issuing personal commands to him, or to Li's subordinates. Chiang complied, a sign of the value he placed on Li's leadership and the caution from which he treated Li and his other Guangxi ally, Bai Zhongxi. As Chiang sought any possible victory amidst retreat and destruction, he really did need Li to deliver results. As part of the public relations front, journalists were given access to commanders on the Suzhou front. Li and his inner circle sought to shape their image as capable leaders to the visiting reporters, with Du Zhongyuan amongst the most active observers. Du Zhongyuan had praised the formidable southwestern general Li Zongren. He was an elegant and refined and vastly magnanimous figure. The reporter used language echoing the era's soldiers' public presentation. Du suggested that Li's forces operated under strict, even discipline orders. The most important point in the People's War is that troops do not harass the people of the country. If the people are the water, the soldiers are the fish, and if you have fish with no water, inevitably you're going to choke. Worse still is the use of our water to nurture the enemy's fish. That is really incomparably stupid. Within the southern front, on January the 26th, the Japanese 13th Division attacked Fangyang and Bengbu in Anhui Province, while Li Pingshan, the deputy commander-in-chief of the 5th War Zone, directed operations south of Suzhou. The defending 31st Corps of the 11th Group Army, after resisting on the western banks of the Qi River, retreated to the west of Dingyuan and Fangyang. By February the 3rd, the Japanese had captured Linhuai Pass and Bengbu. From the 9th to the 10th, the main force of the 13th Division forced a crossing of the Huai River at Bengbu and Linhuai Pass, respectively, and they began an offensive against the northern bank. The 51st Corps, reorganized from the Central Plains Northeast Army, led by Commander Yu Shuzhong, engaged in a fierce combat with the Japanese. Positions on both sides of the Huai shifted repeatedly, producing a riverine bloodbath through intense hand-to-hand fighting. After 10 days of engagement, the 5th War Zone under Zhang Zhujiang, commander of the 59th Army, rushed to the Gujian area to reinforce the 51st Army, and the two forces stubbornly resisted the Japanese on the northern bank of the Huai River. Meanwhile, on the southern bank, the 48th Army of the 21st Group Army held the Luqiao area, while the 7th Army, in coordination with the 31st Army, executed a flanking attack on the flanks and the rear of the Japanese forces around Dingyuan, compelling the main body of the 13th Division to redeploy to the northern bank for support. Seizing the initiative, the 59th and 51st Armies launched a counteroffensive, reclaiming all positions north of the Huai River by the early parts of March. The 31st Army then moved from the southern bank to the north as the two sides faced across the river. Subsequently, the 51st and 59th Armies were ordered to reinforce the northern front, while the 31st Army continued to hold the Huai River to ensure that all Chinese forces covering the Battle of Suzhou were able to safely withdraw. Within the northern front, in late February, the Japanese Second Army began its southward push along multiple routes. The eastern axis saw the 5th Division moving south from Weixian, which is present-day Weifang, over in Shandong province. They captured Yushui, Jiuxian, and Rizhao before pressing directly towards Linyi, as other units of the Nationalist Third Corps of the 40th Army mounted strenuous resistance. The 59th Army was ordered to reinforce and arrived on March the 12th at the western bank of the Yi River in the northern suburbs of Linyi, joining the 40th Army in a counterattack that, after 5 days and many nights of ferocious fighting, inflicted heavy losses on the Japanese and forced them to retreat towards Jiuxian. Over on the western route, the Seiya detachment, which was roughly the size of a brigade of the Japanese 10th Division, crossed the Grand Canal from Jining and attacked Jixiang, meeting stiff resistance from the 3rd Army, and after being thwarted, continued to advance south along the Jinpu Railway. The Isogai Division, advancing on the northern route without awaiting help from the southeast and east, moved southwards from Yangxiadian, south of Zhoushan, on March 14th, with the plan to strike Tangxian, present-day Tongzhou, on March 15th, and then push south towards Shuzhou. The defending 22nd Army and the 41st Corps fought bravely and suffered heavy casualties in a hard battle that lasted until March 17th, during which Wang Mingzhang, commander of the 122nd Division, defending Tung County, was killed in action. Meanwhile, a separate Japanese thrust under Itagaki Seishiro landed at Jiaodong Peninsula and occupied Qingdao, advancing along the Jiaoji line to strike Linyi. Pang Bingshun's 40th Army engaged the invaders in some fierce combat, and later elements of Zhang Zhizhong's 333rd Brigade of the 111th Division, reinforced by the 57th Army, joined Pang Bingshun's forces to launch a double-sided pincer that temporarily repelled the Japanese attack on Linyi. Yet by late March of 1938, a frightening reality loomed. The Japanese were close to prevailing on the Shuzhou front. The North China Area Army, commanded by Itagaki Seishiro, Nishio Tojio, and Isogai Renzuke, were poised to link up with the Central Chinese Expeditionary Force under Hata Shanroku in a united drive towards central China. Yi Zhongren, together with his senior lieutenants Bei Zhongxi and Tong Enbo, decided to confront the invaders at Taiyuezhuang, the traditional stone-walled city that would become a focal point in this war. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and can tell what else produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the-Pacific-War-channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Nanjing has fallen after one of humanity's worst atrocities. Chiang Kai-shek's war command has been pushed to Wuhan, but the Japanese are not stopping their advance. The German mediation is now over. Japan has its sights on Suzhou and its critical railway junctions. Japan does not realize it yet, but she is entering a long war of attrition.